Hello guys. Alright, so today's video is going to be on uh, removing a subject from a background and putting it on a new background. Um, so effectively we are then compositing one image into another. And things like this, we've done with, let's say, the pen tool, like last week. We were able to extract a subject out of an image in order to put it on its own layer. We could add drop shadows and etc. Um, but sometimes with certain objects or subjects, we have trickier areas, like we can see in this section, where her hair is very fine. It would be very difficult to go in and manually go around all of the hair and still make it look um, realistic. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a series of tools to go ahead and extract her from the background. And then we'll start with putting in some different backgrounds, and we'll also talk about fringing and how to get rid of fringing. So that essentially will be when, in this example, she is cut out. Even on the edges of the subject, we'll get a little bit of this gray background incorporated into our cutout. And that just happens. Sometimes worse than other times, depending on what you're working with, but we'll be able to troubleshoot that when we get to that spot. So with that being said, let's talk about the different methods that we can go ahead and extract a subject. In this case, we're going to extract the lady here from the headshot. So in our tools panel, we've got a couple of tools that will work to our advantage. So fourth from the top, if I click and hold, I can see all of the items here that have been condensed into this one section here. And these tools directly relate to extracting from an image. So we mentioned before the magic wand tool, and if we go ahead and click based upon the tolerance that we set, it's going to look for all the shades within, in this case, 32 from what we clicked on. So we can always change that, and let's say 50 shades from this, so we can see now it's gone ahead and adjusted the 50 shades from the point or color that I clicked on and has included a lot more. But this doesn't get us to where we need to go because, well, we want to extract her from the background. So we could potentially keep playing around with this. And you can see the lower the tolerance here, the less it's selected of her, so just the background. And if I go ahead and hit the Alt or Option key here, nope, that's not what I want to do at all. There we go. So what I need to do is hold the Shift key, and that allows me to continuously select areas that I want to include in this selection. Now remember, our intention is to extract the model. Currently we've gone ahead and clicked on the background simply because the background is more simple than trying to click on all the shades within the model. And all that means is that we would then have to go in and reverse or inverse our selection so that instead of having these marching, dancing ants around the background, we would solely have it around the model. And that is pretty easy. We can, where is it up here? Inverse selection. Otherwise, I would use Shift, Command, and I. We've used that command before when we were doing our skin softening as well. So Shift, Command, I goes ahead and reverses that or inverses the selection. So that actually doesn't look half bad. I mean, you can see zooming in, it's certainly not perfect, and you know, none of the tools will get it perfect either way. We've just got to figure out which tool gets us most of the way there, and then we can further define. So what other tools do we have to our advantage? I'm going to Command D to deselect and try this quick selection tool. And the quick selection tool is very much like a brush. We can see that right now it's got a plus in it, so whatever we click and drag upon is going to be included. There we are. If I was to hold the Alt or Option key, I could start to take away from some of this selection. And it actually seems to work a bit better for something like this, just simply because we did a whole lot less clicking. And you know, we can go ahead and further define what was included by just like clicking in those areas to make sure that they're included in our selection. Now, of course, again, we're just selected on the background, so Command Shift I would then go ahead and select our model. And this is not terrible. So what else do we have though? When I am clicked on the quick selection tool, something that is new to Photoshop within the last couple of years or so is this idea to select the subject. And it's as simple as clicking this button. Adobe thinks about it and goes, hey, that looks like what your subject is. And this has done an incredible job, probably a little bit better actually than I did with the quick selection tool just now, and maybe even a better job than the magic wand tool. We also have another tool that's new, and this one is, just in case you missed that, the first one up here, Object Select Tool, or Selection Tool rather. And it's as simple as going down, tracing your, in our case, subject, not object. And I'm just doing a quick job here. And there we go. Not bad at all. I'd say that looks actually pretty good. So whichever tool works for you, you're going to use that in your workflow. Because you know, some people might prefer to do it one way or another. Certainly, if you know, going up to hitting this button here seems to do a good job for you, depending on your subject, then go ahead and use that. It might also depend on what is your subject, what kind of background, is it very complicated that you're working with at this time. That will depend, of course, then on what tool you use. Some will work better for others. Or better than others, sorry. So with that said, right now I've got this set to a background layer. That's okay. I'm going to go ahead actually and just duplicate this so that I have, oh, certainly don't want to do that. So let me deselect, duplicate that first. I'm going to call this lady. I'm going to go back to select subject. Now, if you noticed what that did there, because I had the selection already, and then I hit Command J to copy from the background layer to a new layer, what it did was only selected what I have selected here and put that into the new layer. And that, you know, effectively did cut out our subject, but it didn't do a great job because we're, you know, the hair here is a very unnatural looking shape. And of course, we've got a lot of this background spilling through the curls and etc. So my intent is just to not work on the background layer or a layer that if I mess it up for whatever reason, I can't get back. So that's just why I went ahead and created a background copy. So now that I have this, I'm going to go up to Select Mask. And now it's masked all of the area that I did not select, and that is what we're trying to get rid of. So in case you missed that, just select a mask. And now on the right hand side we've got some options. On the left hand side we've got some tools. And the one that we're going to use is second from the top, called Refine Edge Brush Tool. Now what we can do, and of course if your image doesn't look like this right away, it would just simply be going and choosing which view worked the best for you. And that might depend, of course, on the actual subject. But I always find that having a colored mask, you can change that to red if it's not red, is a lot more obvious to my eye when I'm trying to extract a subject. So all of these options here will allow us to go ahead and refine the selection that we've made. And since we've got a Refine Edge brush tool, it's as simple as zooming in and tracing around all of these areas. And the one thing that you'll start to notice as I go ahead and do this is that it's always re-evaluating. So if I get to a part here and it doesn't bring in all of the hairs at that point, maybe I get to a point up here and it starts to recognize certain patterns, and we'll start to then further develop and refine the area down here that I've already painted on. Now when I paint on this area to try and further define where the pixel edge is that I want to keep, we can of course go in here and define how smooth that line or that selection is. We can feather the line, so feathering is just like when we had the brush tool and we used a hardness, either 0% or 100%, and that hardness basically meant was the brush 100% opacity from edge to edge, or did it fade out towards the edges of the brush. So we can feather that out so the selection looks a little bit more natural. We can further the contrast, so that will harden the edge. And we can shift the edge. So if we've decided when we finish doing our brushing around here that we've still collected too much of the background, so in our case gray, we can shift the edge so that it's further into our subject, and then it will select less of that gray background. But what we're actually going to use is Smart Radius. So by clicking this on, instead of choosing a radius for the size of the brush, the radius is going to be determined by Photoshop itself. So Photoshop is going to look at the edges that we're tracing along and adjust the radius of this brush, or how big the brush is, based upon what we're painting on. And then the last section here, we have some output settings, and we'll deal with that as soon as we refine all of this. It's going to allow us either to decontaminate colors, which will look for any colors that it picked up from the background and remove that right away. This is not my favorite option because you have the least control over this, and it's technically a destructive option, because once we put our selection to either, a layer mask or a new layer perhaps, then what we've chosen here to decontaminate is baked in, and there's no way to get that back if it doesn't look great unless we backtrack or do it over again. So we'll talk about also another way that we can decontaminate colors. Great, so we've got our Smart Radius set. I'm going to just now zoom in, and I'm going to trace around the edge of the subject, basically. And I don't want to use a brush that's really big because I want to be able to go into uh, smaller areas, finer areas. And I don't want it to overanalyze more than it needs to. I just want to trace basically over the edge. So a brush that's a little bit bigger than that edge is quite fine. And I'm just going to go over. You could start to see how that adjusts as we go, kind of smooths out the information. And this is a pretty labor-intensive process as well. So when you are doing this, I highly, highly recommend that unless you need to be um, operating several different programs at a time, that you don't. Right now, I've simply got the screen record happening, and it's taking up quite a bit of processing power. So as we can see, going over all of these areas in the hair, it's now starting to define some of that wispy area that would be nearly impossible for us to um, capture in a cutout otherwise. And I'm just being careful to look over areas that I know need to be smoothed out. And we'll see a little bit of red mask inside the hair. That's okay. Um, Sometimes you'll have to ask yourself, how much does this affect the overall image? What does it look like? And can I improve it? And if it's overly complicated, but most people would never have noticed, then it might be something that you can easily just keep in the image. Unless, of course, you're a perfectionist, I will certainly show you a way as well, especially for those times where trying to cut a subject out like this becomes a little bit more complicated. So we'll keep going around here. I'm just trying to get as much information to be refined as possible, and trying to go in around here. I know I mentioned we're going to go over the edges, but sometimes you have to venture inside where you know that there is, in fact, some area that can be refined. And you want to be mindful when doing this, because as we saw at the top of her head on the left-hand side, that it's very easy to start taking away some important information that we might not be able to get back. But I'm fairly certain with what we have going on right now that any areas which may look like they need touched up, like maybe just here, we can go in and refine that later. And I'm just peeking in here in case I was too distracted to see any spots, missed any certain opportunities to make this as best as possible. And I think that this has done an incredible job capturing all of the hairs that we couldn't when we first tried to select our subject. And I think that looks great. Now bear in mind, we're probably not looking at the image that zoomed in. So in this case, because we couldn't get everything 100% perfect, that is quite fine. And if you find that your Smart Radius did a really good job for a particular image, but you could use a couple fine adjustments, well, that's where you can go in here and choose your global refinement. So smoothing out the selection, feathering the selection, increasing the contrast of the edges, which will make it the opposite of smooth. It'll be a much harder edge. And then, of course, shift that edge. And, you know, right now it doesn't look like I need to apply any of those because this has done an excellent job. So now I can shift down to the output settings, and it's asking me what I want to output to. Now, I don't just want a selection. I actually want to do a layer mask. So if I drop the layer mask, I can go ahead and further refine any areas like up here that maybe I didn't include and I needed to. So we're output to layer mask, and I'm going to hit OK. And now I've got the subject, so she's not cut out, but I've masked this background layer uh, or the background of her so that you can actually only see the model. Now, I know you're looking at it going, well, this is crazy. I still see everything. What did you do, really? That's only because we still have this background here. Now, if I remove that, you can see that she is in fact cut out. And just for the sake of showing you that we can in fact put any kind of background that we choose next to, so we've got the effects, the mask icon. Now we have some adjustments, so adjustment layers. If I click on this, I can add a solid color background, and it's asking me what color, and let's pick something. Can we match her eye color? Funny enough, that's also gray. And that's not too bad. So let's do that. Now, if you're ever cutting a subject out, the background would also need to be taken into account when you're looking at certain things like, you know, how does the hair blend in? If I was to do something, you know, really bright, you might start to see some of those imperfections a little bit more. So keep that in mind, and let's go ahead and pick a color here. Now I've got this background color, so I'm going to just type background color and leave that at that. Perfect. Okay, so the next thing to do would be refining some of these areas. Now, this doesn't actually look so terrible, and I potentially could fix this strand here, as well as up here. This actually doesn't look too bad because it looks kind of like we're just seeing through the way her hair has rusted. But we can actually go ahead and fix this. And to do so, this is how we're going to manipulate our mask. Now, if you ever have a mask and you hold Shift and click on that mask, you can actually temporarily disable it, just kind of like using that eyeball tool, just to see how effective your mask was. Now, if you hold Command and click on the mask, that will actually allow us to go ahead and select the area that the mask is covering. So if for whatever reason we needed a selection of the model, that's how we could go ahead and do that. I'm just going to Command D to deselect. And now if you hold Alt or Option and click on this mask, what it does is inverts it like a Polaroid so that we're just viewing the mask only. We're not actually viewing the image. And this is where we can go ahead and refine this mask by jumping into our brush tool and painting with white or black, because as we've talked about with masks before, what ends up happening is the black portions of the mask are hidden and the white portions are revealed. So black conceals while white reveals is a good way to try and remember how these colors work. So for this particular case, I'm going to try and attach these two. And I don't need a hard brush because I can see there's no hard lines here. And I don't know that that's 100% correct, but that seems like the trajectory of that hair strand, so I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to start to fill in some of this, and all that is going to do is some of this area was a bit transparent, so we could see through it and not in a good kind of way. So I'm just going over to redefine this. Now, depending on what you're doing, if you're in sections that are further in here, you can adjust, your opacity. So I'm just going to match my flow to my opacity number, and that's where we now don't have to go over several times, but I'm not too concerned about being as precise as possible because this is within the selection. I'm not, doing something like connecting hair strands or anything like that. So I know that I'm within the selection, and I can be 100% opacity. And we're just going to go ahead and keep refining this. And it all depends too on what the image is, as we saw, depending on the image itself and depending on the methods that you use, then you might have to do this more than I'm doing it, or you might have to do it less, or not at all. But this is a great way to have the ultimate control over your compositions or your composites. So, okay, now we've got all of that properly filled out. I'm going to go ahead and hit Alt Option again and click right back on that mask. And I might actually just pop back in just to go over this section here. So Alt Option, and hopefully that's not too intense for this section, but we will see. I can always Command Z and go back to starting new. Okay, so Alt Option, click on that mask, and I definitely think that improved it. So this selection is actually pretty darn good. I don't mind that one bit. So now we can actually get rid of this mask. What this mask did was help us to define the cutout. So as opposed to just going to the output settings when we were in the refine edge menu, we use this mask to go ahead and further refine after we used the refine edge brush. So we're going to click on the mask and we're going to drag it down to the trash can, and this gives us a dialog that asks us, do we want to apply the mask to the layer before removing? And what that means is, do you want us to bake in this layer with all of those adjustments we just did with that white and black brush, and then trash the actual layer or the actual mask itself? And that's exactly what we want. We don't want to have to work around the confines of having a mask on this layer when we can just apply those edits to it. And yes, realistically, this is baking it in, so it's a little on the destructive side of things when we would describe this to someone. But right now, we've actually gone ahead and sought to do what we needed to do. So we're going to hit apply, and now we can see that the thumbnail shows us the areas behind her have now been removed. So we do have a pretty darn good cutout of this model. And if you, realize right now before you go forward that there's some areas you need to further refine, you can always just hit that Command Z button and go back to having that layer mask and do what you need to do. Other than that, let's move forward. So again, you just want to apply that layer mask. And now we have this image. Now, realistically, this is a great composite right away. You know, we have a background that works really well with the model. It works really well with the cutout, and you know, we could do anything at this point, add whatever kind of background we wanted if we wished to do that. But I also mentioned to you before that you might perhaps get some fringing, and that is, you know, when you start to get little bits of the background stuck into the cutout that we just made. And I actually don't think that this is terrible at all. In fact, it's done a pretty good job in removing whatever was in between some of the chunks of hair here as well. And to be honest, we didn't really pick a color that was too far off of the realm of blending in with the previous color. See here, I probably could have done that a little bit better. But with our background in, you can't really tell, and that's acceptable. So, with that said, let's see the different ways that we can decontaminate colors. Now, the first way is we can go up to layer and all the way down, and there's this great option here called matting. And if we go into defringe, well, now defringe is almost like shifting um, the edge of this cutout inwards. And what that's going to do is if there's, you know, 3, 4, 5 pixels or so worth of the background clinging onto our subject that we've cut out, we can tell, you know, the 5, 6 pixels, whatever it is, we can put that number in and hit OK, and it's going to go ahead and attempt to scale that back by about those 6 pixels to try and remove any defringing. I don't really find that this works for my type of workflow because it's a guessing game trying to figure out how many pixels do I need to go back from. And sometimes this works really excellent depending on what it is that you've cut out. So for example, a logo, that would work perfectly. For this, I'm not sure that it is the best option. However, if you do, like I said, have logos that you've cut out, such as making a poster where you need a logo, you can go ahead and click these two options, which will help to remove any white or black background that is still attached to your cutout. And this does a great job. But these two here are primarily for logos and that kind of subject, whereas defringe will work much better for a portrait or a more complicated subject. With that said, there's a little bit of a more complicated way that we can actually do defringing. And basically, excuse me, enhancing the outside of this image. And that's as simple as using our blend modes. So I want to create a new layer, and I'm going to call this defringe colors. That seems to make sense. And then what I'm going to do is start painting. So I've got my brush, and I actually want to go in with a brush probably as big as I used for the Refine Edge tool, and I'm going to hold Alt or Option as I continue to go around this subject. And I'm going to keep sampling because there's definitely areas that the subject will have, you know, depending on the light and etc., it'll change quite a bit what you're seeing. And I know you're probably watching this going, oh my god, this looks horrible, what are you doing? Promise it will work out when we change this blend mode. So just trying my best to keep sampling as we go so that we have as realistic edges for the model as possible. And we've almost done this one side. I think that's awesome. Now I am still on 100% opacity. For me at this moment, that seems to be okay. We can always lower the opacity on this layer as well when we're finished if it's too strong. And here we go. Just trying to be as consistent with the color in as possible. Makes me realize that she has a lot of highlights in her hair. And the light is actually beautiful on this model, so that's wonderful. And now you notice that I'm not being, precise with doing this, but I'm, trying to paint over just the areas as much as possible. The main thing is that we're matching the colors. Okay, so I zoom out and you're probably looking at this going, oh my good Lord, what'd you do? So first and foremost, I'm going to change this all the way down to color. And now I'm going to clip because I only want this blend mode to affect the model. I don't want it to affect whatsoever the background. So what I can do is right click on this, and I have a menu here with some options. What I'm looking for is create clipping mask. So it's a little different than the mask that we used previous. What this just does is clips just to the layer containing our model that we cut out, and it's only going to apply the colors to this model. So we can now see it's helped us to fill in some color in the areas of her hair. This is why it was so important to keep pressing Alt or Option to use the eyedropper tool and select an area of color as we went around. And if I on and off, it's so very subtle, but it definitely improved this image. You can see here as well some areas that would be more likely to include little color casts of the original background. So that's off, that's on. Overall, I find this to be the not only most rewarding, but the better way to get in here and not only fix background color cast, but improve the color tonality in this cutout. So that's great. So at any point in time, we can just, go in and change colors, change backgrounds. We can, within reason, of course, change a different background. Some backgrounds will just look hideous. You could place an image in here. So if I go down to place embedded so that the file stays in here, and then I'm going to navigate to week 11, and if I drop in that matrix background, now I'm going to hold shift when I'm doing this because it doesn't matter if it's skewed. Nobody will know what the original image looked like, and that doesn't look half bad. So there we go. We've gone ahead and added even a texture for the background. And then I've lowered the opacity, so basically you still see this green in the background. That actually happened to work out very nicely. So, you know, maybe we're making a cyber ad, and here she is telling you all about the new VPN that you should get. And then, of course, we have a great cutout, so we can experiment, if we wanted, with a drop shadow, and within reason, of course. So I want to move this to where I can see it. Obviously, I don't want to have anything that is unrealistic. So I'm just going to play with these and see what they do. And all this is done is added just a little bit of extra interest in the back and seem to have blended her in a little bit more nicely. So before and after. I think that improved the overall look of that. So what did we do? We went ahead and started with a headshot of this model. We went through the different ways that we could cut her out. We then selected the model. We refined the selection with our refine edge brush. We went ahead and outputted it to a new layer with a layer mask. We went and redefined the layer mask. Then we got rid of the layer mask, but first applied it to our image so that we could do things like apply a drop shadow or any effects if we wanted. We couldn't really do that if we had the layer still attached, so it gave us some more options there. And then we played around with what we had for the background by, in this particular case, using a combination of both a solid color and texture that added a little bit of interest with the opacity being manipulated so that we could see a blend of these two. And there we have it. So I would suggest that you give this a try. Watch the video again if you need to. Pause when you need to. Rewind when you need to. Use this to go ahead and perfect not only your cutouts, but by enhancing the edges of your cutout as well. And there you have it. That will conclude this video. All right, see you next time, guys.